Hello, and welcome to Tea and Tales. I'm your host, and I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Whether you're settling in for a long afternoon, quieting a busy mind that's been working hard all day, or simply seeking the rest that only a good story can bring, you're in exactly the right place. Whether you've had a day full of activity and noise, or a day that was quiet but somehow still left you weary, or perhaps you're simply in need of a few moments of peace and stillness before moving into whatever comes next, we're so glad you're here. Tonight, we have something truly special for you. A story about discovery, about the kind of quiet magic that lives in the everyday world, waiting for those patient enough to notice it, waiting for those willing to look closely at familiar places. It's a story about two siblings who found something extraordinary hidden in the most familiar of places. A story about wonder and connection, and the way siblings share the discovery of something magical. And like all the stories we share here, it's meant to be a gentle companion as you drift towards sleep. A soft voice in the darkness reminding you that wonder never truly leaves us. We only have to pause long enough to find it again. So settle in with us now, and let the world around you fade away. The outside doesn't matter for a little while, with all its demands and expectations and noise. All that matters is the warmth of your blankets, the softness of your pillow, and the quiet comfort of a story that asks nothing of you except to listen. Now, let's take a moment to get more deeply settled into this place of rest. Wherever you are right now, know that you are safe. Your bed, or your chair, or your favorite corner, is a refuge from the busy, demanding world outside these walls. Feel the weight of your body settling in, becoming heavier and more solid with every breath you take, with every moment that passes. If there are any places in your body holding tension, any shoulders raised up toward your ears from the stress of the day, or a jaw that's been clenched since morning, let them all soften now. Just let them relax. Let the tension melt away like ice in warm sun. There's no need to hold on to anything anymore. You can let it all go. Your neck, your shoulders, your back, your legs, your feet, all of it can simply release and settle. And as you do, really notice how good it feels. Notice the softness beneath you, the gentle support that holds you, that cradles you. This is what safety feels like. This is what rest feels like. And you deserve to feel this way, right here, right now, in this moment. There were two children who lived in a house with a garden, and in this garden stood a tree. The older of the two was named Emma, and she was 10 years old, with long brown hair that she often wore in a braid, and a way of looking at the world as though she was always noticing something no one else quite saw. She noticed the small details, the veining of a leaf, the pattern of lichen on a rock, the way a spider's web caught morning light. Her younger brother was Thomas, who had just turned 8, and he had a habit of following Emma everywhere, trusting her completely, even when she led him down paths that weren't quite on the map, even when the destination was uncertain. Where Emma led, Thomas would follow. They lived with their parents and their grandmother in a house that had always felt full of quiet. Their mother worked in a garden shop downtown, designing arrangements and helping customers choose flowers for their homes, and her hands were always slightly stained with soil and plant matter. Their father was a carpenter, and his workshop in the basement was always full of the smell of wood shavings and the sound of careful, deliberate work. The rasp of a plane, the sharp tap of a hammer, the whir of tools. Their grandmother lived with them too, in the upstairs bedroom that looked out over the back garden, and she spent her days reading books and making tea and watching the world from her window, with the kind of patience that only comes from living a long life, from watching many seasons pass. The house itself was an old Victorian, painted a soft grey with dark blue shutters, and it creaked a little when you walked through it, as though it was always whispering to itself about the years it had stood there, about all the people who had lived within its walls. The creaking was a familiar sound, almost comforting in its consistency and predictability. The garden behind the house was wild in a gentle way, not unkempt but not entirely tamed either. There were flower beds that their mother maintained with care and attention. And there were also corners where things grew as they pleased, where ivy crept over an old stone wall in patterns that seemed to shift depending on the light, and where mushrooms appeared after rain in the shadowed spaces beneath the trees, pale and delicate and brief. It was the kind of garden that encouraged wandering, that made you feel like you might discover something if you just looked carefully enough, if you paid attention. Emma and Thomas spent much of their time there, especially in the mornings before school when the dew still clung to spider webs, and in the late afternoons when the light turned golden and seemed to touch everything with warmth. They had favourite spots, places they returned to again and again. A corner where a flat stone made a good place to sit and read for hours without being interrupted. A patch of soft moss beneath the oak tree, where they liked to lie on their backs and watch clouds drift past overhead. A section of fence where they'd carved their initials when they were very young, the letters irregular and rough but unmistakable. The world beyond the garden fence felt large and sometimes overwhelming, filled with schedules and expectations and noise and demands. But within the garden, within these walls, there was a gentleness, a slowness, a sense that time moved differently, more kindly. In the garden, they could be themselves in a way that felt especially true and uncomplicated. Emma liked to bring her sketchbook out and draw the plants, the insects, the way light fell through leaves, trying to capture the subtle beauty that surrounded her. Thomas preferred to make small structures from sticks and stones, building pathways and walls for imaginary kingdoms, creating little worlds that existed only in his imagination. And sometimes they would simply sit together without speaking, watching the way the garden changed throughout the day, noticing how a single shaft of light could make everything look different, how a bird landing on a branch could suddenly make you aware of the whole tree in a way you hadn't been aware of it before, how a breeze could rearrange everything you thought you understood about a place. These quiet, unhurried afternoons were precious to them in a way they didn't quite have words for. They felt like they mattered. They felt like home. One afternoon in early autumn, when the light had begun to shift toward gold and the air carried a slight chill, Emma and Thomas were in the garden doing what they usually did. Emma sketching in her book, Thomas arranging stones into a spiral pattern in the dirt. Their mother was inside preparing dinner. Their father was in his workshop. Their grandmother was upstairs in her room. The garden, for the moment, belonged entirely to them. It was the kind of afternoon where everything feels possible, where the world seems full of secret things waiting to be discovered. The sun was still high enough to cast clear shadows, but the quality of the light had changed as it always does in early autumn, becoming more golden, more precious, as though the world is reminding us that summer doesn't last forever, and we should pay attention to these last bright days. Emma was sitting with her back against the garden wall, her pencil moving slowly across the page, her sketchbook open on her lap. She was trying to capture the way the light fell on a cluster of late-blooming roses, trying to get the texture of the petals right, the slight curl at their edges, the way some were still tightly furled while others had opened fully to the sun. It was difficult work, more difficult than it might appear to someone watching her from across the garden. But Emma didn't mind the difficulty. She'd always preferred challenges that required patience and attention, that rewarded careful observation. Thomas, meanwhile, was engaged in his own creative work a few feet away. He'd found a collection of smooth stones in the garden and was arranging them in a spiral pattern in the dirt, working from the center outward, placing each stone with deliberation and care. He was humming to himself very softly, a tune he'd made up, just a few notes repeated over and over. To anyone watching, they would have made a peaceful picture. An older girl drawing, a younger boy arranging stones, the garden quiet around them, the afternoon stretching ahead without urgency or demands. When she noticed something she'd never quite seen before, Emma almost didn't realize at first that she was seeing something new. It wasn't that it had appeared suddenly. Things don't usually appear that way. Rather, it was as though the light had shifted just enough. A cloud passing overhead for a moment, or the sun catching something at a slightly different angle, to reveal something that had been there all along, hidden not by darkness or distance, but by the simple fact of not looking closely enough. Through the branches of the old oak tree, the same oak tree where she and Thomas had lain on their backs, watching clouds 100 times, counting them, naming them, imagining the shapes they made, there was something that looked like wood. Not the natural wood of a branch, but something constructed, something shaped by hands. It was dark and angled in a way that the branches weren't, and once she saw it, she couldn't understand how she'd never noticed it before. Her pencil stilled in her hand. She set it down slowly and stood up, brushing leaves from her skirt. The movement was gradual, as though she was trying not to startle whatever it was she'd seen, as though sudden motion might make it vanish. Thomas, noticing his sister's sudden stillness, looked up from his spiral and watched her. Emma was good at noticing things. Plants, insects, the way light fell through leaves, the small details that other people overlooked, and Thomas had learned over his 8 years of life to pay attention when she did. She wouldn't stand up and look at something like that unless it mattered. He abandoned his stones and came to stand beside her, looking in the same direction. "Do you see that?" Emma asked, pointing. She kept her voice very quiet, as though speaking at normal volume might break something. It took Thomas a moment, but then he saw it too. There, tucked into the upper branches of the oak tree, obscured from below by leaves and the angle of the trunk, was what could only be described as a small structure. It was difficult to see clearly from where they stood, the branches of the tree creating a lattice of shadows and light that made it hard to focus on anything specific. But the more they looked, the more they could make out. Dark wood, definitely. A slanted roof covered with something that might have been shingles or tiles. A line that might have been a railing. It was substantial. It was real. "How is that possible?" Thomas whispered, as though someone might hear him, as though he was worried that speaking out loud should be loud enough to disturb this discovery, to make it reveal itself or vanish entirely. His voice cracked slightly, the way it sometimes did when he was excited or nervous, or both at once. "I don't know," Emma said, her own voice equally soft. "But it's there. It's really there." They stood in silence for a long moment, both of them staring upward at this thing that had been hidden in their garden all this time. Neither of them moved. Neither of them wanted to break the spell of the moment. Around them, the garden continued its autumn existence. The leaves rustled softly in the breeze. A bird called from somewhere beyond the fence. The air smelled of earth and fading flowers. But for Emma and Thomas, the world had contracted to this one point, this one discovery. The treehouse, for that's what it was, though neither of them had said the word aloud yet, seemed to exist in a space outside of normal time, in a place where different rules applied. The autumn light gave it a golden quality, made it look less like something real and more like an illustration in a fairy tale book, the kind of book their grandmother liked to read to them sometimes, with pictures that looked hand-painted and aged. Emma's heart was beating faster than it had been just moments before. She could feel her pulse in her neck, in her wrists, as though her entire body was vibrating with the significance of what she was seeing. She could feel Thomas's hand slip into hers. In the distance, their mother's voice called them in for dinner, distant and muffled, and from that moment, entirely unimportant. "Come in, you two. It's time to eat." But they didn't answer. They stood very still, their hands clasped together, their eyes fixed on the small structure among the branches, their minds working to understand what they were seeing, to reconcile the fact that this thing existed with the fact that they'd never noticed it before. There was a feeling between them, between the moment, between the garden itself, a kind of recognition, a kind of rightness. This was something they were meant to find. This was something that had been waiting for them. Emma could sense it, the way you sense things sometimes, without words, without logic. Just a knowing that settles into your bones and makes you sure of something, even though you can't quite explain it. As evening began to settle in, softening the gold light into something deeper and warmer, Emma and Thomas found their feet moving toward the oak tree as if drawn by invisible threads. They approached slowly, as though approaching something precious that might startle and vanish. The tree was vast and ancient, its trunk so wide that it would have taken both of them with their arms stretched as far as they could reach to encircle it. The bark was rough and dark, with deep grooves running vertically down its length, and these grooves seemed to tell a story of years and weather, of storms weathered and seasons endured. The tree smelled of itself, a green, woody smell that was both familiar and mysterious. The lowest branches were high enough that neither child could simply walk up them. They were old, need to climb. Emma had always been good at climbing. She'd scrambled up trees since she was small, sure-footed and unafraid, at home in the spaces between earth and sky. Thomas was more cautious by nature, more likely to think about what could go wrong before attempting something new. But he followed his sister's lead without hesitation, trusting her completely, trusting that if she could do it, he could too. Emma placed her hands on a low branch and pulled herself upward, her movements deliberate and careful, measured by a lifetime of understanding how her body worked in relation to the world. The bark was solid beneath her fingers, worn smooth in places by weather and time, textured in others with ridges that gave good purchase. She found a foothold on a knobby section of the trunk and pushed herself up further. Her arms and legs knew this work. As she climbed, the world below receded. She could see the garden spreading out beneath her in all its familiar. A strangeness. The flower beds, the stone wall with ivy crawling over it, the fence with the initials she'd carved there years ago, the corner where they'd been sitting just moments before, though it felt like much longer. Everything looked different from up here, smaller and also somehow larger at the same time, more intricate, more like a painting than a place. She could see the subtle variations in the colour of each flower bed, the shadows cast by various plants, the pattern of the stones in the wall. The perspective shifted everything. What seemed ordinary from the ground revealed hidden complexity from above. Thomas followed, his smaller frame making it easier in some ways, though he moved more slowly, testing each branch before trusting his weight to it. He was methodical, careful, most meditative in his approach. Emma watched from above, ready to help if needed. At one particularly tricky section, where the branches were spaced farther apart than they should have been for small hands and feet to navigate easily, she reached down and offered her assistance. Thomas stretched upward, and their hands found each other. "Keep going," she encouraged, her voice warm and certain. "You're doing well." And Thomas, drawing on a reserve of courage he didn't know he possessed, continued upward. His muscles ached slightly. His fingers felt the strain. But there was something in his sister's confidence that made it possible for him to keep going. As they climbed higher, the treehouse came more fully into view, revealing itself in stages like something coming into focus. It was larger than it had appeared from below, and it was clearly handmade. The walls were constructed from wooden planks, weathered to a soft grey by years of exposure to sun and rain, wind and snow. Each plank was fitted carefully alongside its neighbours. The roof was slanted, covered in shingles that had turned the colour of old silver, that deep, rich colour that only comes with age and weather. There was a small window cut into one side, with what might have been a frame of darker wood, and beneath it, what was definitely a balcony or platform extending outward. A wooden ladder, worn and aged, its steps smooth from use, was attached to the platform, descending toward the branch below. It was this ladder that Emma and Thomas would need to use to reach the entrance, and the sight of it made everything suddenly real in a new way. This wasn't imagining something. This was a real structure, built by real hands, with real details like ladders and railings and windows. When Emma's feet finally touched the wooden planks of the platform, she felt a strange sensation run through her. Not fear, but something like recognition, like coming home to a place she'd never been before, a place she'd lived in her dreams but never in her waking life. The platform was solid beneath her feet, weathered and sturdy. It creaked slightly beneath her weight, but it held, tested by her, and found to be reliable. She turned and watched as Thomas made his final push upward, reaching for the bottom rung of the ladder. His arms stretched to their full length, and his fingers found the worn wood. She leaned down and offered her hands, and together they hauled him onto the platform. The effort brought them close together, and for a moment they held onto each other, steadying themselves on the creaking wood. Both of them stood there, breathing harder than the climb required, their eyes locked on the small door that led into the treehouse. The door was painted a deep blue-green colour, the kind of colour you might find in the ocean or in the twilight sky. That particular shade that exists at the meeting point of day and night. It had a small brass knob, tarnished with age, but still catching the last rays of the setting sun, still reflecting light back out into the world. The paint was worn at the edges, especially around the doorframe and the knob, suggesting years of use, of hands opening and closing it, of weather working at its surface. Neither of them had spoken for several minutes, and they didn't speak now. The silence between them was not uncomfortable or tense. It was the kind of silence that happens when two people are perfectly in tune with each other, when words would only diminish what already existed between them. In fact, speaking felt almost impossible, as though they'd entered a space where language didn't quite work anymore. Emma reached forward slowly and placed her hand on the doorknob. It was warm beneath her palm, warmed by the sun that had been beating down on it all day, and the warmth seemed to pulse gently, as though it was alive. She twisted it gently to the right, and the door swung inward with barely a sound, as though it had been well-oiled and carefully tended, as though it had been waiting to be opened. The hinges were silent, smooth, and the door glided open to reveal what lay beyond. What they saw inside made both of them catch their breath, a sudden intake of air that happened without conscious thought. The interior of the treehouse was small, but perfectly proportioned, a space that seemed to have been designed with great care and consideration. Soft light filtered in through the window and through gaps in the wooden walls where the planks didn't quite fit flush against one another, creating thin lines of golden light. This light, combined with the fading daylight outside, gave the space a dreamlike quality, made it feel less like a real place and more like something imagined. The walls were lined with shelves, and on the shelves were objects that seemed to have been collected over a long time. Smooth stones worn by water and time, small pieces of coloured glass that caught and scattered the light, feathers from birds in shades of brown and grey and black, shells that spiralled inward like tiny staircases leading somewhere secret, a few old books with cloth bindings that were soft with age, a wooden box whose lid was carved with intricate patterns that might have been trees or mountains or both at once. In the centre of the space was a low table, crafted from dark wood, and around the table were cushions in faded jewel tones, deep blues and purples and greens that reminded Emma of stained glass windows in old churches, the kind she'd seen in pictures. There was a lamp hanging from the ceiling, suspended by a chain, its base crafted from brass that had oxidized to a gentle greenish brown. And beside one wall was a trunk painted with scenes of forests and mountains and rivers, landscapes that might have been real places or might have been entirely imagined. Everything in the space was arranged with intention, with purpose, as though someone had thought very carefully about how it should be and had taken great care to make it feel like a place where you could rest, where you could think, you could be yourself without any pretense or performance. Without any masks. Emma stepped fully into the space, crossing the threshold between outside and inside, between the ordinary world and this extraordinary sanctuary. Thomas followed her, closing the door softly behind them. The floor was covered with a patchwork of fabric, bits of cloth in different colours and textures sewn together to create a kind of rug, and beneath their feet it felt soft, cushioned, as though they were walking on something carefully chosen to be kind to the soles of their feet. The air smelled of old wood and something herbal, something like dried lavender or sage, the kind of smell that brings calm and quiet. And underneath that, the green smell of living wood and leaves, the smell of the tree that held the M. It was a smell that made you want to breathe deeply, to fill your lungs with it, to let it settle into your very being. Emma moved toward the window and peered out, and from this vantage point, she could see the entire garden in a way she'd never seen it before. She could see all the way to the fence line, could see the street beyond where cars occasionally passed, could see the houses on the other side of the street with their windows beginning to glow as evening deepened. But looking outward also made the interior of the treehouse feel more enclosed, more protected, more like a true sanctuary, a hidden place that existed in its own separate reality. Thomas had moved to one of the shelves and was examining a feather, long and dark and luminously beautiful, each barb perfect and precisely arranged. It came from a crow, he said with certainty, though he couldn't have said exactly how he knew, couldn't have named the process by which he'd arrived at this knowledge. Emma nodded. She was standing before the cushioned seating area, looking at it as though it might give her answers to questions she hadn't yet asked, questions she was only beginning to form. The cushions looked old and worn, softened by use, but they also looked inviting, as though they were waiting for someone to sit on them, to rest, to settle in and make themselves comfortable. Without discussing it, without needing to discuss it, without even exchanging a glance, both children moved toward the cushions as though drawn by the same invisible force. Emma lowered herself onto one of them, and the cloth gave beneath her weight in a way that felt perfect. Not too soft and enveloping, not too firm and unyielding, but exactly right, as though it had been made for this moment. Thomas sat beside her, their shoulders nearly touching, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. They simply sat in the gentle light of the treehouse, breathing in the herbal smell, listening to the whisper of the leaves outside, feeling the slight sway of the tree as the evening breeze moved through its branches. The tree swayed so gently that it was almost imperceptible, but it was there, a rhythm that echoed the breathing of the world itself. A feeling of peace had settled over both of them, the kind of peace that comes from finding something you didn't know you were looking for, from discovering a place that seems to exist outside of time, outside of the busy, demanding world, with all its schedules and expectations, in a space where simply being is enough. Emma reached out without thinking and took Thomas's hand, and he held it tightly, grateful for the anchor, for the confirmation that they were both really here, that this was real, that they weren't alone in this discovery. As the minutes passed, evening deepened into true dusk, and the quality of light within the treehouse began to change in subtle ways. The golden tones of late afternoon gave way to something softer, more blue, the colour of twilight itself. The shadows that the objects on the shelves cast grew longer, stretching across the patchwork rug in dark, meandering patterns. Emma became aware of the tree around them, not just the trunk that held them up, but the living wood, the flow of sap, the intricate network of roots that extended into the earth below, drawing water and nutrients upward in an endless cycle. It was as though, sitting here in this space, she could somehow feel the tree's consciousness, the slow pulse of its life. She squeezed Thomas's hand gently, and he turned to look at her, understanding without words that she was feeling something significant, something that required acknowledgement. Gradually, as though they had wordlessly agreed that it was time, both children stood and began to explore more fully. Emma moved first toward the shelves, her eyes tracing the objects that had been so carefully arranged. She picked up a stone, smooth and pale, worn by countless years of water moving over it. The stone was cool in her palm, solid, real, grounding. She thought of rivers and streams, of water's patient work, the way it could soften even the hardest things, given enough time and persistence. Next to the stone was a piece of blue glass, and when Emma held it up to the last light coming through the window, the glass glowed like a piece of sky captured and held in miniature. She understood suddenly that someone had lived here. Not just built the treehouse, but lived in it, spent time here, collected these things with intention. These weren't random objects. They were treasures. They were things that someone had found meaningful enough to keep, to display, to share with whoever might eventually discover this place. Thomas, meanwhile, had moved to the wooden trunk with the painted landscapes. He opened it carefully, expecting to find something inside. But it was empty, lined only with a faded red cloth. The cloth was soft, worn thin in places, and it smelled vaguely of something that might have been cedar, though the scent had long since faded to near invisibility. He ran his small fingers across the painted exterior, tracing the delicate strokes that depicted mountains and valleys, forests and streams, a world that was both impossible and somehow deeply familiar. He turned to Emma and raised his eyebrows in a question, and she moved over to stand beside him. Neither of them could explain the feeling that something was supposed to be in that trunk, some object or treasure that would complete the picture of this place. But it was empty. It had been waiting, perhaps, for them to fill it, or perhaps it was full of memories that were visible only to certain eyes, only at certain times. Thomas ran his hand along the interior, feeling the texture of the cloth, understanding in some wordless way that this emptiness was significant, that it was waiting for something that would come later, that might involve them. The lamp that hung from the ceiling drew Emma's attention next. She reached up toward it, then hesitated, unsure if it was safe to touch it. Instead, she simply stood beneath it, looking up at the brass base, at the way the metal had turned that distinctive greenish color with age, at the way it caught what remained of the light. There was a switch on the cord, a small brass switch that looked as though it had been operated thousands of times, the metal worn smooth in the exact shape of a thumb or finger. Emma reached up slowly and pressed it, not really expecting anything to happen. She was in a treehouse that seemed to exist outside of normal reality, so electricity seemed unlikely. But when she pressed the switch, the lamp bloomed to life, and a warm golden light spilled from the shade, illuminating the entire interior of the treehouse in a way that transformed it completely. The shadows that had been deepening in the corners retreated, and the colors of the cushions became vivid and rich, almost jewel-like. The objects on the shelves were suddenly clearly visible, each one distinct and separate and precious. Thomas made a small sound, not quite a gasp, but something close to it. He looked at Emma, his eyes wide, and she could see her own astonishment reflected there. Neither of them had words for what they were experiencing. The logical part of their minds knew that there shouldn't be electricity running to a treehouse in a garden in their neighborhood, that bulbs shouldn't illuminate when switched on after who knew how many years. But another part of them, the part that recognized the magic of this place, the part that understood they had entered a space where different rules applied, accepted it completely. The light simply was. It existed, and therefore it was real, and therefore it needed no explanation beyond its own existence. With the light on, they could see even more detail. There was a thin layer of dust on the shelves and the objects, but not excessive, not the thick accumulation of dust that would suggest years of abandonment. It was as though someone had been here recently, or as though the dust itself was reluctant to gather in this place. The dust that was present seemed to be treated with reverence almost. It wasn't something to be cleansed away aggressively, but rather allowed to settle gently, like snow on a winter morning, marking the passing of time without destroying the objects beneath. Emma examined the books more closely now. They were old, their cloth bindings soft and faded, their pages yellowed but not brittle. The titles were printed in gold lettering that had mostly worn away, so she could only make out fragments. One seemed to be about gardens. She could make out the word botanical, and something that might have been growth. Another appeared to be a collection of stories or poems, the kind of book that someone might read again and again in quiet moments for comfort or inspiration. The binding especially wow, worn in the middle where the book naturally opened to a particular passage. A third had no clear title that she could discern, but when she opened it carefully, she found it was full of drawings, landscapes and trees and people and things that existed nowhere in the natural world, things that were clearly imagined, clearly dreamed into being by whoever had drawn them with such care and precision. Thomas was looking at the cushions more closely now. He picked one up and examined it, turning it over in his hands. The fabric was different on each side. One side was a smooth velvet in deep blue, and the other was a softer, more textured material in a shade of purple. When he pressed his face against it, it smelled faintly of lavender, confirming what Emma had sensed earlier when they first entered. Someone had intentionally scented these cushions. Someone had cared deeply about how this space would feel to someone in it. Thomas set the cushion down gently and picked up another, this one in green. It was the same. Carefully chosen fabrics, deliberately scented, arranged with thought and love. Emma found herself moving toward the small table in the center of the space. It was made of dark wood that seemed to absorb the lamplight rather than reflect it, and it had 4 legs that were carved with intricate patterns, spirals and leaves, and what might have been birds or other creatures. The top of the table was slightly worn, as though hands and elbows had rested on it many times. The finish softened and dulled in those particular spots where someone had worked repeatedly, day after day, year after year. She placed her own hand flat on the surface and closed her eyes. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she saw something, not a vision exactly, but more like a memory that wasn't hers, a glimpse of someone sitting at this very table, writing perhaps, or sketching, or simply sitting and thinking, watching the light change through the window as seasons shifted outside. The figure was unclear, the face indistinct, but the feeling was unmistakable. Contentment, peace, a sense of purpose and belonging. The image was there, and then it was gone, too quick to capture fully, too vivid to have been purely imagined. When she opened her eyes, Thomas was watching her. He'd seen something pass across her face, some recognition or understanding, and he moved towards her, his smaller frame seeming even smaller in the lamplight. "Are you okay?" he asked, and his voice sounded different here in the treehouse, more resonant somehow, as though the space itself was adding depth and richness to his words, as though the very air was listening to him. Emma nodded slowly, still processing what she had experienced. "I'm fine. I'm more than fine. There's something here, something more than just a place. It's almost like the treehouse remembers things, or like someone left part of themselves here." Thomas accepted this without question, understanding intuitively that his sister was describing something real, something that mattered, something that couldn't be explained in ordinary language. Thomas considered this, his young face serious, thoughtful. "Maybe they did," he said. "Maybe whoever built this wanted to leave something behind, something for someone to find." His words were simple, but Emma understood that he had grasped something fundamental about this place. It wasn't haunted in any frightening sense, but it was inhabited by memory, by intention, by the echo of someone's care and attention. This was a gift that had been left behind, waiting through the years for the right people to discover it. The window drew them both eventually. Emma moved toward it and looked out at the garden below, which was now quite dark, the shapes of plants and flowers visible only as shadows, mere suggestions of the vibrant things that existed in daylight. But here and there, small lights were coming on in the houses beyond the fence, windows illuminating in the gathering darkness, creating a pattern of gold and amber dots against the blue-grey of the evening sky. She could see the outline of her neighbour's roof, the silhouette of trees against the slightly lighter sky, the pavement of the street that led to places she knew, school, the park, the shops downtown. But looking at all of this from the treehouse, it seemed to belong to a different reality entirely, a reality that was somehow less true than the space she was standing in. The world outside seemed distant, almost unreal, like something happening in a story or a dream, something that was observed rather than inhabited, something that could be set aside for now in favour of this present moment. The treehouse, by contrast, felt intensely real, more real in some ways than anything they'd experienced before. It was as though they'd stepped into a pocket of truth hidden within the ordinary world, a place where things mattered more deeply, where meaning was visible and tangible, where the objects and spaces and light itself all contained significance that went beyond the merely physical. As they watched the evening deepen, something began to happen that was subtle at first. So subtle that Emma almost missed it. But the cushions on the floor seemed to be glowing very faintly, a soft luminescence that came from within the fabric itself rather than from the lamp above, as though the cloth had absorbed light over years of use and was now releasing it slowly into the darkness. And the objects on the shelves appeared to be emitting their own gentle light, each piece casting a faint aura around itself like a halo. The feathers seemed to shimmer with iridescence that hadn't been visible before, colours rippling across them in patterns that seemed to shift and change when she looked directly at them. The coloured glass pieces glowed like small lanterns, casting coloured shadows on the walls, blue, green, amber, red. The stones seemed to emit a silvery radiance, as though they contained within them the memory of moonlight on water, as though they had been holding onto that light all along, waiting for the right moment to release it. Emma reached over and switched off the lamp, expecting the treehouse to plunge into darkness. Instead, the interior remained illuminated by the gentle, mysterious light emanating from the objects themselves and the cushions beneath them. The light was neither bright nor dim, but perfectly calibrated to be enough to see by, to move by, to exist in without any sense of darkness or shadow. It was the kind of light that you might find in dreams, the kind that makes everything it touches seem both more itself and more mysterious at the same time. Thomas's hand found Emma's again, and they stood together at the window, watching this impossible thing, accepting it completely because resistance would have been pointless, and because somewhere in their young hearts, they understood that impossible things were not only possible but necessary, that the world contained more wonder and magic than most adults were willing to admit. Emma became aware of a sound, very soft, almost below the threshold of hearing, but definitely present. It was a kind of humming, a sustained note that seemed to come from the tree itself, from the wood that surrounded them, from the very structure of the place. It wasn't loud enough to be startling, but it was distinct enough to be noticeable once you became aware of it. It was the sound of a tree living, perhaps, the sound of sap moving through the veins of wood, the sound of growth happening at a pace too slow for the normal human ear to detect, but nevertheless real and present. Or perhaps it was the sound of time itself moving differently here, time flowing at its own pace, indifferent to the clocks and schedules of the human world outside. Whatever its origin, the sound was deeply comforting, a vibration that seemed to synchronize with Emma's heartbeat, with Thomas's breathing, with the fundamental rhythms of being alive. The treehouse walls, when Emma touched them, were warm. Not hot, but genuinely warm, as though they were alive and filled with blood, as though the structure itself was a living thing that had chosen to shelter these two children for this one perfect evening. She ran her hand along a plank of wood, feeling the grain beneath her fingertips, feeling the history of the tree in the texture of the wood, the rings that marked years of growth now smoothed by human hands and time. Each mark was a year, she knew, each ring a full cycle of seasons, and these planks had come from wood that had lived for longer than she and Thomas had been alive, perhaps longer than their parents had been alive. The treehouse was made of time itself, constructed from years and seasons, from summer heat and winter cold, eld from rain and sun and the patient work of living. Something on one of the shelves caught Emma's attention. Not the objects themselves, but something behind them. Something that looked like a leather journal or a small book. She reached carefully and drew it forward, disturbing the dust as little as possible. The cover was worn soft leather in a shade of brown that was almost black, and embossed on the front in faded gold lettering were two initials. She traced them with her finger, trying to make them out, but the lettering had worn smooth with age and use, and the letters were indecipherable. She opened the journal carefully, afraid that the pages might crumble with age, but they were flexible and soft, well preserved by the dry air of the treehouse interior. The first page contained writing in a careful, neat hand. The handwriting was neither masculine nor feminine, but something in between, the hand of someone who had spent a great deal of time writing, who had developed a personal script that was distinctive and precise. The words read, "For those who find this place, for those with eyes to see and ears to hear, for those willing to believe in the small magics that make life worth living. Welcome home." Emma's breath caught in her throat. She looked at Thomas, and his eyes were wide, reflecting the soft glow of the objects on the shelves. This was what had been waiting for them. Not just a place, but a message, a welcome. The treehouse had been left here, carefully tended, magically protected, waiting for whoever needed to find it. And they had found it. Of all the children who might have lived in this house, in this garden, they were the ones meant to discover this secret. They were the ones meant to read these words. She turned the page slowly and found more writing. On this page, the author had written a series of short passages, observations about the treehouse, about its purpose, about what it meant to step beyond the boundaries of the ordinary world and into a space where different rules applied. One passage read, "The treehouse is a refuge. It exists outside of time. Here, you can be precisely who you are, without performance, without pretense, without the need to become anyone else. The treehouse asks nothing of you but your presence, your openness, your willingness to wonder." Another passage stated, "Magic is not spectacle. Magic is not illusion. Real magic is the way a simple object can carry meaning, the way a space can hold intention, the way understanding can pass between two people without words. Magic is connection. Magic is recognition. Magic is the moment when you realize you are not alone in your understanding of what matters." Emma's fingers traced the words on the page, feeling the indentation of the pen that had written them, the pressure of a hand that had cared enough to put these thoughts down, to leave them behind. There were more passages as she continued turning the pages, and each one seemed to speak directly to something in her that she had never quite been able to name. One read, "The ordinary world insists that you be ordinary. It tells you to fit in, to follow the rules, to not ask too many questions. But there are places, hidden places, where the rules are different, where you are allowed to be extraordinary, where your questions matter, where your observations matter, where your presence matters simply because you exist." And then another, "When you are in the treehouse, do not try to understand how it works. Do not question the physics of the light that comes from the objects. Do not wonder about the magic that surrounds you. Simply accept it, feel it. Let it teach you that the world is far stranger and more wonderful than the everyday version would have you believe. The acceptance itself is the magic. The willingness to wonder is what opens the door. Thomas leaned closer to read along with her, and Emma could feel the warmth of his breath, the solid reality of his presence beside her. This moment, this shared moment of reading these words together, of understanding together that they were not alone in their sense that the world contained more than what was immediately visible, felt precious to her in a way that was almost overwhelming. She wanted to stop time, to hold this instant forever, to never move beyond this threshold into whatever came next. There were pages filled with sketches as well as words. Emma found drawings of the treehouse itself from different angles, with careful notations about the materials used, the design choices, the way the structure had been integrated into the living tree without harming it. There were sketches of the objects on the shelves, each one drawn with meticulous detail. There was a series of watercolor paintings depicting the garden through different seasons. Spring flowers in full bloom, summer greenness and abundance, autumn colors shifting from green to gold to red, and winter's spare beauty with bare branches and frost-covered stones. Looking at these paintings, Emma felt a pang of something like longing. She understood, looking at them, that whoever had created this space had loved the garden deeply, had watched it change through many years, had captured what mattered most about each season. As Emma read aloud, her voice soft and careful, Thomas listened with his whole being. These words seemed to speak directly to something inside him, to affirm something he had felt but never been able to articulate. The treehouse was indeed a place of magic, but it was a magic rooted not in fantasy or escape, but in truth, in authenticity, in the power of one person creating a sanctuary and leaving it behind as a gift for others. It was a magic that required belief, but belief rooted in reality, in the tangible world, in the objects you could touch and the words you could read. He watched his sister's face as she read, watched the way her eyes moved across the page, the way the soft light of the treehouse illuminated her features, made her look both very young and somehow ageless at the same time. As night settled more fully over the garden, Emma and Thomas sat within the treehouse with the journal between them, reading passages aloud to each other, pausing to discuss what they meant, what they suggested about the person who had created this place. They didn't know who that person was, and in some way, it didn't matter. What mattered was that someone had loved this space enough to build it, to furnish it with care, to infuse it with intention. What mattered was that they had found it, that they were welcome here, that the journal had essentially said, yes, you belong. This place was made for people like you, for people who notice things, for people who understand that the world contains more magic than most people acknowledge, for people who are willing to believe. Thomas asked Emma to read one passage again, one that had struck him particularly deeply. The visitors who come here will eventually leave and return to the world outside. They will leave the treehouse, but the treehouse will not leave them. It will live in their memory. It will reshape the way they see things. It will remind them, for the rest of their lives, that magic is possible, that the world is more wonderful than it first appears. That is enough. That is everything. As he listened to the words a second time, Thomas felt something shift within him. He understood, with the clarity that comes sometimes to children when the universe decides to show them something true, that this moment was remaking him, that his understanding of what was possible in the world had just fundamentally changed, that there would be a before and an after, with this treehouse marking the boundary between them. He would never be quite the same person after tonight, and neither would Emma. They both knew it. They could feel it happening. The cushions seemed to grow even softer as they sat, responding to their presence, to their belief, to their acceptance of the impossible magic surrounding them. The light from the objects continued to glow with that mysterious, dreamlike luminescence. And now Emma noticed something new happening. The light was beginning to pulse gently, growing slightly brighter and then slightly dimmer in a rhythm that matched the sound of the trees humming, that seemed to synchronize with human heartbeats. She wondered if the treehouse was breathing, if it was alive in some fundamental way that transcended the usual definitions of life. She wondered if it was responding to them, to their presence, to their willingness to believe in it. Emma found herself becoming drowsy, not from tiredness in the physical sense, but from a deep relaxation that seemed to settle into her bones, a profound contentment that came from being in exactly the right place, at exactly the right time, with exactly the right person. Thomas was curled up next to her, his small body warm, his breathing deep and even. The treehouse held them both gently, the way a mother might hold her children, with complete acceptance and unconditional welcome. She could feel the gentleness of the space, the way it was protecting them, shielding them from the demands and expectations of the world outside. Here, there was no need to be anyone but themselves. Here, there was nothing required of them but presence. The air itself seemed to have changed, become softer somehow, more receptive. When Emma breathed, it felt as though she was breathing in possibilities, as though the very air was full of potential and wonder. She could taste something faint and sweet on her tongue, something like honey mixed with lavender, though she hadn't eaten anything, though there was nothing in the air to taste. But the taste was there, unmistakable, real as anything she'd ever experienced. It was the taste of the treehouse itself, she realized. The taste of magic, of intention, of love made tangible. Thomas whispered something, so soft that Emma almost didn't hear it. "I don't want to leave," he said. "I don't want this to end." And Emma understood completely. She too wanted to stay here forever, in this suspended moment, in this perfect space where nothing demanded anything of them except to simply be. But even as she thought this, she understood that they couldn't stay, that eventually they would have to climb down from this treehouse and return to the world outside, that whatever happened in this space would have to be enough to carry them forward, back out into the busy, complicated world with its schedules and expectations and noise. Outside, the night sounds of the garden continued, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a night bird, the subtle settling of growing things into sleep. These sounds drifted in through the gaps in the wooden walls, creating a backdrop for the humming of the tree. But here inside, there was a perfect silence beneath those distant sounds. A silence that was not empty, but full of presence and intention, and the accumulated love of whoever had created this sanctuary. Emma could feel the attention of the space focused on them, could feel the treehouse welcoming them, holding them, affirming that they belonged here, that they had always belonged here, that somehow, across years or decades or perhaps even longer, this place had been waiting for them to arrive. She reached over and took Thomas's hand, holding it firmly, grounding herself in the reality of him, in the solid warmth of his small hand in hers. She closed her eyes, still holding the journal against her chest, still feeling the subtle vibration of the trees humming, still hearing the distant sounds of the garden. And in that moment, in the perfect intersection of the magical and the real, Emma understood something that would take her many years to fully comprehend. She understood that the treehouse wasn't trying to tell them to escape from the world. It was trying to teach them something more important, that the world itself was magical if you knew how to look, that ordinary places contained extraordinary things if you paid attention, that the magic wasn't separate from reality. It was woven through reality, available to anyone willing to notice it. Nothing in the world outside mattered anymore. Nothing but this. Nothing but this perfect, magical moment, suspended in time, waiting to be remembered. waiting to reshape how they saw the world, waiting to open them to possibilities they had never imagined before. The treehouse held them both in its gentle embrace, and the night continued its soft progression toward deeper darkness, toward the hours when sleep claims those who are ready to let it, toward the threshold between waking and dreaming where the most real magic seems to dwell. When sleep finally came, it was as though they descended into a different layer of the space itself, with rooms within rooms and depths within depths, each one deeper and more profound than the last. Emma's dreams were vivid and clear, more real than waking dreams usually are, and she found herself walking through gardens that shifted and transformed with each step she took. These gardens were memories. She understood somehow in that dream way where knowledge comes without asking. Moments the treehouse had held through seasons and years, and perhaps even longer. Flowers bloomed and faded in accelerated time, opening like hands, unfurling, and then closing as seasons compressed into heartbeats. Trees grew tall and bent low to shelter her, creating canopies and archways designed specifically for her to walk beneath. Leaves fell in cascades, swirling around her in graceful patterns, and she could smell them as they fell. The green of living growth, the brown of decay, the sweet earth where seeds waited to germinate. The colours shifted from spring green to summer gold, to autumn fire, to winter white. The full cycle of the year playing out in moments, in heartbeats, in breaths. Throughout these dream gardens, she felt the presence of someone who loved this place deeply, whose hand was visible in every detail, whose attention and care had shaped every inch of the space. In her dreams, Emma could see the hands that had painted the colourful door, the one that had greeted her when she first arrived at the treehouse. She could see them selecting each colour with meticulous care. Blue like the sky on a perfect summer day, green like new leaves in spring, yellow like sunlight falling through windows, purple like the sky at twilight when day was transforming into night. She could see them mixing the paint in careful proportions, testing shades, adjusting hues until they were exactly right. She could see them applying brushstrokes with both deliberation and joy, moving with the practiced confidence of someone who had done this work many times, who understood the language of colour and form. These were hands that understood something fundamental about the importance of beauty, that knew with absolute certainty that colour could change how people felt when they saw it. That colour was a language in itself, capable of speaking directly to the heart without needing to pass through words or logic. The hands belonged to a figure that remained mostly unclear, the face indistinct and shifting. But Emma understood this was someone who had loved deeply, someone who had poured care into this space, the way a parent pours love into a child, with the kind of love that asks nothing except the opportunity to give, that expects no gratitude and no recognition, that is simply offered freely to the world. The treehouse was not just a place. It was a love letter, written in wood and paint, and carefully chosen objects. A message saying without words, I care about beauty. I care about peace. I care deeply about those who will come here after me, and I hope my care will reach across the years to touch them, will make them feel less alone, will remind them that the world is capable of gentleness and intention and love. Thomas's sleep was different but equally profound, taking him to places that were uniquely his own, shaped by his particular way of experiencing the world. His dreams were less visual and more sensory in nature, less about seeing and more about feeling and touching and hearing and tasting. He dreamed of textures in the most intimate way, the smoothness of wooden walls worn soft by years of hands touching them, the softness of cushions that seemed to absorb warmth and give it back in waves, the complicated grain of the rug where he could trace the weaver's path through the pattern, row after row of intention and care. He could feel these textures against his skin, could understand them completely through touch. He dreamed of sounds, the tree's low humming that seemed to come from deep within its wood, from the core of the living thing, a sound that you could hear and feel simultaneously. The gentle patter of night sounds from the garden, the shuffle and rustle of nocturnal creatures going about their business, the whisper of wind moving through leaves from branch to branch. He dreamed of smells, lavender from the cushions, cedar from the wood, the faint scent of old paper from the journal, the indescribable scent that belonged only to the treehouse itself, that unique combination of wood and time and care and intention. These smells created pictures in his mind, memories that weren't his, stories written in scent. In his dreams, Thomas understood something fundamental. All these sensations were a language, a way of communicating that required no words or images or any of the usual methods of conveying meaning. The treehouse was speaking to him through what he could touch and hear and smell, telling him things his conscious mind couldn't quite grasp, but that his deeper self understood with absolute clarity. It was telling him that he was welcome, that he belonged, that the world contained more gentleness than he had ever imagined possible, that there were places where you could rest completely and be safe, where you didn't have to be anything other than exactly who you were, where being yourself was enough. As they slept, the treehouse grew warmer around them, and this warmth was not the kind that comes from external sources like fire or sun, but rather the kind that radiates from the place itself, as though the wood and the construction and the very structure were all alive and breathing out warmth like a living organism. The cushions cradled their bodies perfectly, shifting slightly and subtly, as though they possessed their own intelligence, as though they were alive and actively engaged in the work of comfort, responding to the weight and temperature of the sleeping children with attentiveness and care. The light from the objects on the shelves pulsed gently and rhythmically, growing slightly brighter and then slightly dimmer, in a pattern that matched the rhythm of their breathing, that synchronized perfectly with the rhythm of their heartbeats. Emma's heartbeat in perfect time with the pulsing light, matching its cadence exactly, as did Thomas's, until the boundary between their biological rhythms and the rhythm of the light became indistinguishable. The treehouse had synchronized itself completely with them, had tuned itself to match their frequency, was moving in perfect harmony with their life force, the way an orchestra tunes to a single note, so that all the instruments can play together in perfect unity. The walls glowed faintly from within with soft phosphorescence that came from the wood itself, that seemed to emanate from within the grain and the structure of the place rather than being reflected or projected from outside. This light was both soothing and deeply reassuring, the kind of light that you might see in dreams or in memories of perfect safety, the kind that makes everything it touches seem both more itself and more mysterious. Time moved differently here, more slowly than in the world outside, or perhaps not moving at all. Hours might have passed, or minutes, or no time at all. There was no way to tell, and it didn't seem to matter. Time itself had become fluid and negotiable, something that could be stretched or compressed or stopped entirely, depending on what was most needed. Presence and peace were more real, more true, more important than the measurement of time. In the deeper part of the night, when the garden outside had settled into profound stillness, when even the night insects had grown quiet and only the distant hoot of an owl suggested there was anything alive in the world beyond the treehouse, Emma became aware in that liminal space where dreams and reality merge and become indistinguishable. She wasn't quite awake, not fully asleep either, but something within her could sense the tree house showing her something, trying to tell her something important without using any of the usual methods of communication. The space was communicating a kind of history directly into her understanding, downloading it as a feeling rather than as words or images. She could sense the years that had gone into building this place, not as a number, but as a weight of attention and care spanning months or years or perhaps decades. She could sense how each plank had been carefully chosen and fitted, how the space had been thoughtfully integrated with the living tree. She could sense the seasons that had passed while the treehouse stood sentinel in the garden. Spring had brought fresh green leaves and birdsong. Summer had arrived with its heat and growth. Autumn had painted the world in fire colours. Winter had wrapped everything in frost and snow. Dozens of seasons, perhaps many decades. The treehouse had endured through all of it, had stood watch, had kept its vigil. She could sense the intention that lay beneath every surface, every object, every carefully chosen element. The books selected not at random, but with specific purpose. The cushions chosen for their particular colours and their carefully selected scents. The objects on the shelves gathered and collected because they held meaning, because they had stories to tell, because they represented something important about the nature of beauty and care and attention. Nothing in this space had been chosen by accident or by chance. Every single decision had been made with great deliberation and with the future in mind, made with awareness that whoever built this would not be the one to use it, that it was being created for someone else, for future visitors who didn't yet exist. The person who built the treehouse had been building it for someone, building it for children like her and Thomas, for people with eyes to see and hearts to feel, for those who desperately needed to know that the world contained magic, for those who might otherwise grow up without understanding that such spaces existed, that such deep care and intention was possible, that such gentleness could still exist. This understanding came to Emma as feeling and certainty, a knowing that bypassed language and logic, going directly to some deeper part of her consciousness. She knew with perfect clarity that the treehouse had been waiting for her. Not Emma specifically, but for someone like her, for the kind of person who would recognize what this place was offering, who would accept its magic. Her presence here mattered. Her acceptance of the magic mattered. Her willingness to believe mattered deeply. The treehouse needed to be found by the right people, needed to be believed in by those who could understand its nature. It needed witnesses to its magic, people who would carry its memory into the world, who would tell the story and help others understand that such places existed, that magic was possible. Once you had experienced this, once you had believed, you could see magic in other forms, in other spaces, in other people. Thomas, in his own way, was receiving similar communication. Where Emma's experience centered on understanding and history, Thomas's was more primal, about connection and belonging, the fundamental need to matter. He was dreaming of being held, of being safe in a way he'd never felt before, of being perfectly fine just as he was. The treehouse was showing him that he was exactly the right size, exactly the right age, exactly the right kind of person for this moment. He didn't need to change anything about himself. There was nothing wrong with him. He was perfect just as he was. The treehouse was saying to him what no one else could. You belong. You are welcome. You are exactly who you should be. As the night deepened further, both children seemed to emit a kind of light themselves, as though they had absorbed the magic and it now radiated from within their bodies. Their skin took on a faint luminescence that matched the glow of the objects on the shelves. Their breathing synchronized with the humming of the tree, became one with it, until you couldn't hear where one sound ended and the other began. They had become part of the treehouse, and the treehouse had become part of them. The boundary between self and space had grown thin and permeable. They were no longer two separate beings sleeping in a magical place. They had become elements of the magic itself, had joined the community of objects and intentions and love and care. They belonged here because they had allowed themselves to be here, because they had accepted the welcome, because they had opened themselves to believing in something larger than themselves. Slowly, gradually, without any sense of disruption or abruptness, the night began to shift in subtle and almost imperceptible ways. The darkness outside the windows lightened almost imperceptibly, so subtly that you would miss it if you looked directly at it. But if you looked away and then looked back, you would notice that something fundamental had changed. The color moved from deepest black, the complete darkness of the deepest night, toward dark blue, the color of twilight and deep water. Then it moved gradually toward a lighter shade of blue, touched with the faintest suggestion of grey, the color that comes just before dawn, when the sun is still below the horizon. But its light is beginning to touch the upper atmosphere and change the quality of the darkness. The night was preparing to end. The morning was beginning its slow and inevitable approach, and somewhere in the depths of their sleep, in those dreams that were so vivid and real that they felt more true than waking could ever be, Emma and Thomas became aware of this change. They didn't wake, exactly, didn't open their eyes or become fully conscious in the way that waking normally happens. But they became conscious that a threshold was approaching, that an invisible boundary was drawing near, that the magical night was nearing its end, that soon, inevitably, they would need to return to the world outside the treehouse. Emma found herself thinking, in that dream state way, where thought flows without effort, of the journal that they had found on the shelf. She thought of the passages they had read together, the words that had spoken so directly to something deep inside her. She thought particularly of the passage that had spoken to her so powerfully. The treehouse is a refuge. It exists outside of time. Here, you can be precisely who you are. She had been precisely who she was all through this night, without any pretense and without any performance, without the need to become anyone other than exactly Emma. And it had been enough, more than enough. It had been everything. She had felt accepted and welcomed and affirmed in a way that she had never felt before. And that feeling was worth more to her than almost anything she could imagine. But she also understood, even as she thought this, that she could not stay here forever. That to remain would be to refuse the growth that came from living in the world, from facing challenges and learning. The magic was not meant to be hoarded or kept for herself, but carried back out into the world, spread like seeds on the wind, like pollen drifting through air, like light pushing back through darkness. The treehouse had given her something precious. Now she would have to discover what she would do with that gift, how she would carry it forward. Thomas was thinking about the colours, and this thought occupied his dreaming mind with something like wonder and longing. The jewel tones of the cushions, the colours of the objects on the shelves catching light from unknown sources and glowing softly. The colours he had seen in his dreams, colours that seemed almost alive, that shifted and changed as you looked at them. He wanted to remember these colours for the rest of his life. He wanted to paint with them someday, to surround himself with them, to find them again and again in the world. The treehouse had shown him that colour mattered deeply. Beauty mattered. Paying attention to small things mattered. The world was full of small, beautiful moments that most people missed because they weren't paying attention. But if you could learn to see them, if you could train yourself to notice the exact shade of light falling through a window, or the way a colour could make you feel less alone, then life became infinitely richer and more meaningful. This knowledge would stay with him always, would remind him of this night and this place, and this feeling of being held and welcomed. The eastern sky grew lighter and more defined with each passing moment, and the light began to change in fundamental ways as the sun approached the horizon, still invisible, but making its presence felt through the quality of the light itself. Birds began to sing their first tentative songs, calling to each other as though asking if it was truly time to begin the day, and the night was truly ending now. The spell that had held the treehouse in perfect suspension was beginning to release its grip, and though it happened so gradually that it was almost imperceptible, there was no question that something fundamental was shifting. Emma's eyes opened slowly, fluttering like the wings of a bird, waking from a long sleep, and she lay still for a long moment without moving, taking in the interior the treehouse in what was not quite light but something approaching it, a kind of twilight that wasn't fully dark anymore but wasn't fully bright either. The objects on the shelves were less luminous now, their inner light fading perceptibly as the external light of approaching dawn grew stronger, And there was something almost sad about watching this happen, about seeing the magical glow recede as the ordinary light of the world reasserted itself. The cushions beneath her were still warm and comfortable, still holding the shape of her body, but they felt less responsive, less like they were actively cradling her and keeping her safe, and more like they were simply cushions. However beautiful and carefully chosen, the tree itself was still present, still standing around them, still humming its low, constant song. But the hum seemed to be changing, becoming fainter, as though the tree was slowly releasing them from its protective embrace, as though it was saying goodbye and giving them permission to leave. She looked down and saw that Thomas was still asleep beside her, his face perfectly peaceful in the way that only sleeping children can be peaceful, his chest rising and falling with slow, deep breaths that matched the pace of his dreams. She didn't want to wake him. She didn't want to disrupt this moment, didn't want to be the one to bring him back into consciousness and awareness of what was happening. She wanted to let him sleep for as long as possible, because she knew that the moment he woke would be the moment they would have to begin their journey back to school and dinner and regular life and all the complications that came with it. So she sat very still, watching him sleep, watching the light grow gradually stronger around them, watching the treehouse transform incrementally from a magical space suspended outside of time into something more ordinary, something more like a regular room in a regular structure made of wood and nails. But it was still beautiful. Even as the obvious magic faded, as the objects on the shelves lost their mysterious glow and became simply objects again, the care and intention that had created this space remained visible and present, remained evident in every plank of wood and every carefully chosen object. Someone had loved this space. Someone had cared deeply about every detail, had put thought and attention and love into every decision. That care was still visible, still evident, still real and present, even as the more supernatural aspects of the magic began to withdraw. Emma reached over and gently touched her brother's shoulder, her hand soft on his arm. It was time. Thomas's eyes opened slowly, fluttering at first, and then focusing gradually as consciousness returned to him, as he moved from the dream world back into waking awareness. For a moment, he looked genuinely confused, as though he couldn't quite remember where he was. Then recognition returned to his face, and that understanding brought with it a kind of sadness, a kind of resignation. He understood that the night had ended, that they had to go. He sat up slowly, his small body moving with reluctance, every fibre wanting to remain. They didn't speak. There was nothing to say. What had happened in the treehouse existed beyond language, beyond the reach of words to capture or describe properly. To try to put it into words would be to diminish it somehow, to make it smaller and less true, and less significant than it actually was, to reduce something infinite to something bounded by syllables and sentences. Instead, they simply sat together in silence, taking in their final moments in the space, trying to burn the memory of it into their minds with such intensity that it would never fade, trying to fix every detail in perfect clarity so that when they were back in the ordinary world, separated from this place by distance and the demands of daily life, they could revisit it in memory, could remember exactly how it had it to be held in this way. Emma looked at the journal one more time, her eyes tracing the worn leather cover and the faded gold lettering. She wanted to take it with her, wanted to bring it back to the ordinary world, to have it as proof that this had been real, as a voice from the Creator that could speak to her even after she left this space. But she understood, without needing to be told, that it belonged here. It belonged to the treehouse, was part of the treehouse, was meant to remain in this space as a message for whoever came next, as a welcome and an affirmation for all who would discover this place after her. She set it carefully back on the shelf where she had found it, placed it with reverence and care, as though she was handling something sacred. It was the voice of whoever had created this place, the only direct communication they would ever have with that person. Thomas was holding one of the cushions, one of the deep purple ones that had been so soft and comforting throughout the night. He pressed his face against it one more time, breathing in the scent of lavender and something else, something that belonged only to this place, trying to memorize it completely, trying to make it a permanent part of his sense memory so that it would stay with him always. When he set the cushion down, his eyes were bright with unshed tears, but he didn't cry. Instead, he took his sister's hand, and together they moved toward the trapdoor that led back down to the regular world. The descent was slow and careful, deliberate and intentional, as though they were trying to make the transition between worlds as gradual as possible. Emma went first, testing each rung of the ladder carefully, making sure it was solid before committing her full weight. Thomas followed, his small hands gripping the wooden rungs tightly, holding on as though he might fall away from the world if he let go. As they climbed down, the treehouse receded above them, becoming smaller and less present with each step lower, less substantial, less real, as though it was fading back into whatever realm it truly belonged to. The garden below grew more distinct, more real, more demanding of their attention, pulling them toward itself with the weight of ordinary reality. By the time Emma's feet touched the ground, stepping onto the damp earth of the garden below, the treehouse seemed almost like a dream, something that had happened in another world, another time, another version of reality entirely, but she could still feel its presence. She could still feel the way it had held her throughout the night, could still feel the warmth of that embrace, could still sense the intention and the care and the love that had surrounded her. When Thomas reached the ground, he immediately looked back up at the tree, his neck craning back so he could see into the branches above. From down here, the treehouse was barely visible, just the faintest suggestion of structure hidden among the leaves and branches, so well camouflaged that you could walk past it 100 times and never notice it, never suspect that anything unusual was hidden there. It was nestled in the branches in such a way that it seemed to be part of the tree rather than something imposed upon it, its wood matching the color of the tree's trunk, its roof blending into the surrounding foliage. This was part of its magic. It wasn't meant to be obvious or prominent or demanding of attention. It was meant to be found by those who needed to find it, who had the eyes to see it, who were ready to believe in it. Everyone else could walk past without ever knowing it was there. The sky was growing lighter with each passing moment, changing with visible rapidity now that the sun was close to breaking above the horizon. The eastern horizon was definitely touched with color, pale orange like a ripe peach, soft pink like the inside of a seashell, the promise of sunrise and the beginning of a brand new day. The garden was beginning to wake more fully. Birds sang with more confidence, with full voices rather than tentative calls. A slight breeze moved through the trees, carrying the scent of growing things and earth and fresh morning dew. The world was returning to its normal rhythm, its normal pace, its usual way of being. But Emma and Thomas did not feel normal. They felt different, changed, transformed in ways they were only beginning to understand. The night in the treehouse had altered them profoundly, had opened their eyes to possibilities and realities that they would be processing and understanding for years to come. They knew, without discussion or words, that they would come back, that this would not be their only visit to this space, that they had been marked now, chosen now, invited into a mystery that would occupy them for the rest of their lives, that would define how they saw the world and understood themselves and their place in it, that would give meaning and depth to everything that came after this night. They stood together for a long moment, looking up at the tree, at the place where the treehouse was hidden among the branches, at that invisible structure that contained so much magic and intention and care. And then, Without speaking, without planning to do so, or even consciously deciding that it was time, they simply held each other. It was a way of saying something that had no words, a way of acknowledging that they had shared something profound together, something that had permanently changed them both, something that had created a bond between them that would never break. The embrace lasted only a moment, but it felt eternal in its intensity, felt like it contained all the time they'd spent in the treehouse compressed into a single moment, all the magic they'd experienced, and all the love and intention they'd felt surrounding them and holding them. When they finally let go of each other and turned to walk back toward the house, the morning light was touching the tops of the trees, turning the highest leaves to gold, making them glow like they were made of metal or light itself. The dew on the grass and the leaves was catching the light and sparkling brilliantly, creating a landscape that seemed almost as magical as the treehouse itself, almost as though the magic was starting to seep out into the regular world. Behind them, hidden in the branches, the treehouse waited. It would wait for them to return. It would wait, knowing that they would come back, knowing that they couldn't stay away, knowing that the magic that had touched them in the night would keep drawing them back to this place. It would wait, patient and gentle and full of intention, for the next visitor who needed to find it, the next person who was ready to believe in magic. But for now, Emma and Thomas walked back into the world, carrying the treehouse with them in their hearts, carrying its lessons and its warmth and its absolute affirmation that the world was more magical and more beautiful than they had ever imagined possible, that there were places of safety and intention waiting to be found, that love could be left behind as a gift for strangers, that the world was worthy of wonder. The morning had fully arrived by the time they reached the back garden of their house. The light was clear and ordinary now, the magical quality of dawn fading into the pragmatic brightness of a regular day. Their mother was still asleep inside. They had learned long ago that the best time to slip out unnoticed was in those early hours before the household woke, and they had been careful to return before anyone would miss them. They moved quietly through the back door, leaving traces of morning dew on the kitchen floor as they walked through. Emma found herself noticing small things with new eyes. The way the sunlight fell through the kitchen window, the particular shade of blue on the ceramic bowl on the counter, the way dust motes moved through the air like tiny dancers. Everything seemed to contain a kind of quiet beauty, a gentle intention, as though the whole world had been painted and arranged with the same careful attention they had felt in the treehouse. She knew Thomas was seeing it too. They didn't need to speak. There was an understanding between them now that words would only diminish, would reduce something vast and interconnected into small separate sounds. They went upstairs quietly. Emma changed out of her damp clothes and into dry ones for school. Thomas did the same. They moved through their morning routines as though sleepwalking, their bodies performing the necessary actions while their minds remained partially in the treehouse, still suspended in that space that existed outside of time. When they came down for breakfast, their mother was standing at the stove making eggs, humming something to herself. She didn't ask where they'd been. She didn't notice anything different about them, though Emma felt sure that something fundamental must have changed, that they must be glowing with it somehow, that everyone should be able to see what had happened to them during the night, but nobody could see it. The transformation was internal, invisible to the external eye, visible only to those who had experienced it or who had the particular kind of perceptiveness required to notice such things. School that day felt strange and distant, as though Emma and Thomas were moving through it from very far away, as though there was a thick pane of glass between them and the ordinary events unfolding around them. The classroom felt small and ordinary. The lessons seemed trivial compared to what they had learned in the treehouse. Mrs. Chen was writing about fractions on the board, trying to explain how parts could make up a whole, and Emma found herself thinking about the treehouse, about how all the separate elements, The cushions and the books and the objects on the shelves and the journal and the carefully chosen colours all came together to create something whole and unified and perfect. That was what the treehouse had taught her. That attention to individual elements, care put into each separate piece, created something beautiful when combined. That meaning and beauty came from intention and connection. She paid attention to Mrs. Chen's explanations with new understanding. By the time they got home that afternoon, the pull toward the treehouse was almost unbearable. It felt like a physical force, like an invisible cord that had been tied around their hearts, gently but persistently pulling them back toward the garden. Neither of them had to suggest it. They simply made eye contact across the kitchen table, and understanding passed between them. The kind of understanding that exists between people who share something profound, who have been through something together that has fundamentally changed them. No words were needed. They set their backpacks down with careful deliberation, as though moving through water, as though the ordinary world had become somehow thicker and more resistant to motion. They changed into clothes that didn't matter if they got wet, loathes that were expendable, clothes that wouldn't create questions if they came back damp. And then they headed back out into the garden, drawn by something stronger than logic, stronger than the rules of the ordinary world. Oh, the afternoon light was completely different from the magical dawn light of that morning. It was ordinary and bright and clear, the kind of light that flattens everything it touches, that makes the world seem more prosaic and less mysterious. The tree looked like just a tree, like something you might see anywhere, something unremarkable and ordinary, something that would not normally warrant a second glance. From this angle, in this light, the treehouse was completely invisible, hidden so skillfully among the branches and leaves that you would think the whole thing had been a dream, that they had imagined the whole experience during an afternoon nap. But they knew what it contained. They knew what was hidden in its branches. They could feel it, could sense its presence the way you can sense someone watching you even when you cannot see them. And as they drew closer, as they looked up and located the barely visible structure nestled among the leaves, the tree seemed to shimmer slightly. It was just the light playing tricks, probably, just a momentary illusion created by the angle of the sun and the movement of the leaves in the breeze. But it felt like acknowledgement. It felt like the treehouse was recognizing them, was aware of their presence, was welcoming them back. The climb up the ladder was faster this time, more confident. They had made this journey before. They knew what to expect, or at least they thought they did. Their hands knew where to grip. Their feet knew where to step. Their bodies remembered the exact height of each rung and the exact distance between them. They moved with the fluidity of people who had practiced something many times, who had integrated the knowledge into their muscles and bones. The trapdoor opened smoothly at their approach. It didn't even seem to require pushing. It simply opened, as though they had activated it through presence alone, as though their arrival was signal enough. It was as though the treehouse had been waiting for them, had been ready since they'd left that morning, had never truly let them go, had been holding space for them, maintaining itself in perfect suspension, keeping every element exactly in place, waiting for this moment when they would return. Stepping back into the space was like stepping back into a dream, like returning to somewhere you'd known your whole life but had forgotten, and were now remembering, with a flood of recognition and relief so profound that it almost knocked the breath out of Emma's lungs. The fairy lights were glowing softly even in the afternoon brightness, visible as subtle halos of golden luminescence if you looked at them carefully, less obvious than they had been in the darkness but undeniably present. The cushions were arranged just as they had left them in their comfortable clusters and piles, still holding the impression of their bodies from the night before. The books were on the shelves, spines facing out, waiting patiently for readers who might never come. The objects were in their places, carefully arranged on the shelves, glowing with their own inner light as the afternoon sun touched them through the windows. Everything was waiting. It was all exactly as it had been, as though time had not passed, as though they had only stepped out for a moment and now Ed back in to find everything suspended in amber, held perfectly in place by intention and care, and something that might have been magic, but that also might have been something as simple and profound as love. But something was different too. The air felt charged somehow, felt like it was vibrating with something, felt pregnant with possibility and meaning. The treehouse seemed more present somehow, more real, more alive than it had even been in the night, when it had been suspended in darkness and magic. In the afternoon light, it revealed itself more fully, showed more of its depths, exposed more of the layers of intention and care that had gone into its creation. Emma walked slowly through the space, her eyes taking in every detail with new attention, her hands lightly touching the smooth wood of the walls, feeling for the warmth she'd felt before, finding it still radiating from the carefully worked surfaces. Thomas did the same, his body moving almost reverently through the familiar space, as though this was a sacred place, as though the act of walking through it was itself a kind of prayer or meditation. They both came to the shelf where the journal waited and stopped there, drawn as if by magnetic force, drawn by a hunger for understanding that went beyond the merely intellectual, that came from the depths of their being, that was asking for meaning and finding it here, in this place, in this book. Emma reached out and took the journal from the shelf with both hands, lifting it carefully, as though it was something fragile or precious or both. This time, opening it felt different. The cover, which had felt heavy the night before, felt light now, seemed almost eager to open. This time, the pages seemed to have something new to tell them, seemed to be different pages than the ones they had read before, though Emma knew that was impossible, knew that nothing had changed except their own capacity to understand. The handwriting was the same, elegant and careful and full of intention, each letter precisely formed, each word chosen with deliberation. But the passages seemed different, or perhaps Emma was different. Perhaps having experienced the treehouse, having felt its presence surrounding her through the night, having felt how it had held her and welcomed her and made her feel less alone in the world, she could now read between the lines in a new way, could understand things that had been hidden from her before, could see meanings that had been there all along, but that she had not had the eyes to perceive. One passage seemed to leap out at her, seemed almost to glow on the page, seemed to be the exact passage that she needed to read in this moment, at this time, in this place. It said, "A second visit is never the same as a first. The first visit is always wonder, always discovery, always the shock of encountering something new and unexpected. The first time you walk through a door, you see only the novelty of it, the strangeness, the difference from everything you have known before. But the second visit is different. The second visit is when you begin to truly understand. The first time you visit a place, you see it with wonder, with eyes wide and heart racing. The second time you visit, you see it with understanding. You recognize what was always there beneath the surface. You begin to comprehend the depth of what you have been given. You start to understand that every detail was chosen, that every color was selected with intention, that every object was placed with great care, that nothing in this space is accidental or random. The wonder transforms into something deeper. Wonder becomes reverence. Wonder becomes gratitude. Wonder becomes something that looks like love. Emma read this passage aloud to Thomas, her voice soft and wondering, her words careful and deliberate, as though she was conveying something of great importance, something that needed to be said aloud to be fully real. He listened with his whole being, his small form completely still, his eyes fixed on her face as she spoke. His entire consciousness focused on understanding every word, every nuance, every implication of what his sister was reading to him. When she finished, they both stood in silence, understanding in their bones that this was exactly what was happening to them, that this passage had been written for them, that the creator of this place had somehow known that they would return a second time, and that they would need these words. This was the second visit, and it was different. The shock of discovery had faded, melted away like morning mist under the sun's warmth. But something more profound had taken its place. They understood now that they had been loved, that someone had loved them before they ever arrived, had anticipated their arrival, had prepared this space for them with the kind of love that asks nothing in return, that expects no gratitude, that is simply offered freely to the world. They understood that someone had created this space with children like them in mind, with future visitors in mind, with a pure and uncomplicated desire to give something beautiful and comforting to the world, to ensure that anyone who found this place would know that they were welcome, that they were worthy of care, that the world contained gentleness and beauty and intention. That understanding filled them both with a kind of gratitude so profound that it almost hurt, so intense that it was almost painful in its depth and reality. Thomas walked over to the objects on the shelves and began to look at them more carefully than he had the night before, with the kind of attention that comes from understanding something significant, from wanting to truly see and understand what he was looking at. He picked up the smooth river stone and turned it over in his small hands, feeling its weight, which was reassuring and solid, admiring the way it caught the light and threw it back, admiring the colours hidden within its surface that only appeared when you looked at it from just the right angle. He could feel the years of water flowing over it in the river, could sense the patience of the stone, the way it had allowed itself to be shaped and smoothed by forces beyond its control. He picked up the music box and wound it carefully, with the exact amount of tension needed to make it work without breaking it, listening as it played its quiet melody. A melody that sounded like it came from another time, from a gentler age, from the kind of place where magic was still possible. He looked at the pressed flowers in their careful arrangements, understanding now that someone had gone through the work of pressing them. The delicate, patient work of selecting each flower, pressing it carefully between pages, waiting weeks or months for them to dry completely, and then arranging them in these patterns. Someone had done this work, had preserved these flowers specifically to bring beauty to this space, had known that looking at dried flowers could somehow comfort people, could somehow help them understand that beauty was worth preserving, that fragile things were worth protecting. He picked up a small carved wooden bird and marvelled at the craftsmanship, at the way someone had taken the time to carve something so small and beautiful, something that could fit in the palm of his hand, knowing that future visitors might hold it, might appreciate it, might feel the care that had gone into its creation, but never knowing their names or their faces or their stories. He was beginning to understand the kind of love it took to create a gift with no expectation of recognition, no need for gratitude, no desire for the creator's name to be remembered. It was the kind of love that poured itself into creating something beautiful and then let it go, trusted it to the world, trusted that it would be received by someone who needed it, that it would do its work without the creator ever knowing whether it had succeeded or failed. He was beginning to understand that this kind of love might be the purest kind there was, the kind that asked nothing and expected nothing and simply offered itself freely, like light from the sun, like air that you could breathe, like the steady hum of the tree that held this space in its branches. Emma found herself turning to the coloured stones on the shelf, the ones that caught the light and glowed in soft, rich jewel tones, colours that seemed almost impossible, colours that seemed to belong to another world. She sorted through them now, understanding them differently than she had understood them the night before. Someone had collected these stones. Someone had walked through the world, through riverbeds and beaches and gardens and places she could only imagine, and found these particular stones and brought them here, one by one, accumulating them over time, creating this collection of beauty and light. How long would that have taken? Weeks, months, years? How much dedication would it require to collect such a varied and beautiful collection? To arrange them so that the light would see, etch them and make them glow just so? To create an arrangement that was both aesthetically pleasing and practically functional, that served the dual purpose of beauty and light catching? She held one up to the light and watched as the afternoon sun turned it into something luminous and alive, something that seemed to contain light rather than simply reflect it. This one was like holding bottled starlight, like holding the captured essence of 1,000 nights spent gazing at the sky. This one was like holding trapped sunlight, like holding the warmth of a summer afternoon in her palm. This one was like holding the essence of a summer sky at twilight, that moment when day was transforming into night, and the whole sky was painted in colours that shouldn't exist but somehow did. She understood now that every single object in this space was a love letter. The whole treehouse was a love letter, written in objects and colours and careful arrangements and intentional choices, a message from one person to the world saying, "I care. I paid attention. I notice beauty, and I wanted to share it with you." As the afternoon light began to change, growing softer and more golden with each passing moment, they found themselves moving back toward the cushions with a feeling of inevitability, as though they had always been meant to end up here, as though this moment had been waiting for them since the beginning of time. They had been awake all night, had attended school in their bodies while their minds remained partially in the treehouse, had moved through their day in a kind of dreamlike state, and now the tiredness was beginning to catch up with them, beginning to weigh down their limbs and their eyelids and the very edges of their consciousness. But it was a good kind of tiredness, a kind that came from emotional intensity and profound experience, rather from mere physical exhaustion, a tiredness that came with the satisfaction of having understood something important, of having been changed by an experience, of having been held and welcomed by something larger than themselves. They settled into the cushions again, sinking into their soft embrace, and it was as though the treehouse was welcoming them back to rest, was inviting them to deepen their understanding through sleep and dreams, was suggesting that there were truths that could only be reached through the dream state, through the liminal space between waking and sleeping, where logic did not rule and symbols became more real than facts. As they lay there, the afternoon light streaming through the windows, creating patterns on the walls and the cushions and their skin, they held hands. It was a simple gesture, but it felt important in a way that went beyond the merely physical. It felt like a way of saying, "We are in this together. We will understand this together. Whatever this place means, whatever it is trying to teach us, we will learn it together. We will not experience this alone. We will carry this knowledge together." And their hands, joined together, became a kind of anchor, a point of connection between them, a way of maintaining their unity, even as they were about to slip away into the separate worlds of dream and sleep. The treehouse seemed to pulse around them in response, seemed to acknowledge their commitment to each other and to this place, seemed to understand that they had pledged themselves to this experience, that they were ready to go deeper, that they were prepared for whatever the treehouse wanted to show them. The cushions shifted and settled, cradling them with infinite gentleness, responding to their bodies, moulding themselves to their shapes, becoming exactly what they needed in that moment. The light dimmed gradually as clouds moved across the sun, not darkening the space but softening it, making it more peaceful, more conducive to rest and dream. The air filled with the peaceful quiet of afternoon rest, with a quality of silence that was not empty, but full of presence and intention and care. The scent of lavender seemed to grow stronger, seemed to drift through the air with visible presence, seemed to be inviting them downward towards sleep. Emma found herself drifting off, her mind moving into that space between waking and dreaming, where the boundaries become soft and permeable, where the rules of the waking world no longer apply, where time becomes fluid and negotiable, where meaning can be conveyed without words, where understanding comes directly without need of explanation. In this space, she found herself understanding something about the connection between her brother and herself, something that had always been true but that she had never had the words to understand or express. They had come into this world from the same beginning, had shared a womb, had entered the world at nearly the same moment, seconds apart, separated by such a small amount of time that they might have been one person arriving in two bodies. Their connection predated their individual consciousness. They had been together before they were even fully themselves, before they had identities separate from each other, before they had begun the long process of becoming distinct individuals. The treehouse seemed to know this. It seemed to recognize that they were two parts of something whole, that they belonged together, that their bond was something ancient and fundamental and true, something that had been woven into their very being at a level that was deeper than genetics or heredity or environment, something that was simply part of who they were at their most essential. Thomas's sleep was filled with sensations that were becoming increasingly familiar to him, sensations that were beginning to feel like home, like the essence of safety and peace. The smoothness of the wood beneath his fingertips, even in sleep, the scent of lavender and cedar drifting through the air and filling his lungs with each breath, the gentle hum of the tree, a vibration that seemed to be coming from the very foundations of the structure, the subtle warmth radiating from the cushions and the walls, and seemingly from the treehouse itself. A warmth that was not the dry heat of a radiator, but the living warmth of something alive and breathing. In his dreams, he moved through landscapes that were composed entirely of these sensations, worlds built entirely from texture and scent, and so worlds that were more real and more true than the waking world had ever been. He dreamed of weaving through gardens of silk, his hands trailing through fabric that felt like clouds, that felt like water, that felt like the softest thing he had ever touched. He dreamed of forests of soft wood, where he could press his face against bark that felt like velvet, where every surface was inviting and welcoming and warm. He dreamed of meadows of lavender scent, where the air itself seemed to have substance, where breathing was like tasting something sweet and gentle, where scent became taste, became sound. He dreamed of music that you could feel, of colours that you could hear, of a complete synesthesia where all his senses blended into one another and created a unified, beautiful experience of the world, where there was no distinction between the different ways of perceiving reality, where a sound had a texture and a colour had a temperature, and every sensation was connected to every other sensation in a web of meaning and connection. In these dreams, he understood that this was what the treehouse was teaching him, that this was the deeper truth that it was trying to help him understand, that the world was not divided into separate categories of sense and experience, but was instead a unified whole, where everything connected to everything else, where a colour could contain a sound and a text could tell a story, where the boundaries between different types of perception were artificial human constructs and not fundamental features of reality itself. As evening came on and darkness began to gather once more in the spaces between the trees, as the day wound down and the night prepared itself to arrive, Emma and Thomas slept on undisturbed, safe in their understanding of the treehouse and its intentions, safe in the knowledge that this place existed to hold them and to welcome them and to teach them things that could not be taught any other way. The treehouse grew warmer around them as the outside temperature dropped, seemed to glow more brightly, seemed to be more present and more real with each passing moment, as though it was coming fully alive, as though daylight had merely dimmed its power, but darkness was when it could truly express itself. The fairy lights brightened, becoming the primary source of illumination as the external L8 faded completely, becoming the only light in the darkness, guiding the space, drawing the children deeper into the dream state. The objects on the shelves seemed to glow from within, but not with an external light. They glowed with an internal luminescence that came from the objects themselves, as though they had absorbed light during the day and were now slowly releasing it back into the darkness, creating their own gentle illumination. A light that came from within rather than from without. A light that spoke of internal illumination, of things that carried their own light with them. The air filled with the scent of lavender and wood, and something like old paper and old time and old care. Scents that mingled and blended, creating an atmosphere that was thick with meaning and presence and intention. The treehouse was fully present now, fully awake, fully engaged in the work of holding and protecting and teaching these two children who had found their way to it, who had been seeking it without knowing they were seeking, who had needed it without understanding what they needed. It had been waiting for them through all the years, patient and eternal and constant. It had been created for them, or for children like them, for those who needed to know that the world contained magic, that beauty was possible, that intention and care could be left behind as gifts for strangers, that love could be expressed through objects and colours and careful arrangements. All around them, the treehouse spoke in its language of objects and colours, and careful arrangements and loving intention, spoke a message that had no words, but that meant everything, every word and every syllable and every breath. You are welcome here. You are exactly who you should be. You are loved. As the night deepened and true darkness fell outside, Emma and Thomas slept the sleep of the deeply content, the sleep that comes from having found something you didn't know you were looking for, the sleep that comes from being held by something larger than yourself that cares about your well-being with a kind of love that asks nothing in return. And in the morning, when they woke and had to return to the world once more, they would carry this second experience with them, would carry this deeper understanding that the treehouse was not just a place of magic, but was a place of meaning, a place where someone had poured their love into creating something beautiful for the world. They would know with absolute certainty that they would return. They would know that this was only the beginning of a relationship with this place that would define much of the rest of their lives. They would know that magic was real, that love was real, that beauty and intention were real, and that these things mattered more than almost anything else in the world. The night stretched on, peaceful and perfect, the treehouse glowing softly in the darkness, like a small piece of heaven that had come down to earth and hidden itself in the branches of a tree, waiting for the right people to find it, waiting for Emma and Thomas and anyone else who might discover it in the years and decades to come. The tree hummed its ancient song. The fairy lights glowed their gentle glow. The cushions held the sleeping children with infinite patience and infinite love. And the night was perfect and peaceful and full of a kind of quiet wonder that asked nothing but to be experienced and remembered and carried forward into the world.